Okay, do you want me to go put this on and then come back and test it?
Yeah.
Do you have me muted or do I need to turn it off on here? Okay, I'll be right back.
Holding your breath is safer than breathing. When letting go is braver than keeping. When innocent words turn to lies, and you can't hide by closing your eyes. When pain is all that they offer, like a kiss from the lips of a monster. You know the famine so well.
Well, good morning, all of you out there. Welcome to Watershed. My name is David Roberts. I am one of the pastors here on staff, and as you will come to find out very clearly in the coming moments, I will be your guide this morning. You'll see a lot of me. Hopefully that is acceptable to you. But we are so excited that you are joining us this morning in what is hopefully our last exclusively digital Sunday morning experience here at Watershed. So hopefully you are hyped and stoked about that. If you don't know what I'm talking about, stay tuned. I will be back shortly with more information. But just thank you for joining us this morning. Get comfortable. Let us know where you're tuning in from. Normally you guys do a fun question. I didn't come up with anything. Oh well. Tina, you are in charge of picking the question this morning. Hopefully you are here to hear that. If Tina is not here yet, I'll trust someone else to tell her that she is in charge of picking the greeting question this morning. And I'm going to leave you all to it. I will be back shortly, but enjoy now the wonderful work of our incredibly talented musicians.
That second wind. We're gonna be alright, we're gonna be alright. I've seen the look in your eyes. We're gonna be alright. I said we're gonna be alright, we're gonna be alright. I see the look in the sky. We're gonna be alright.
Oh, it's okay to grieve. It's okay to learn to fall, and it's okay to believe. To admit that you're human after all, and it's okay to heal all the scars that are buried deep inside, and it's okay to feel, say all the things you've been trying to hide. We are always in motion, like the winds, the tides, the ocean, and every day I'm born again. I wake up and feel that second wind, and we're gonna be alright, we're gonna be alright. I've seen the look in your eyes. We're gonna be alright. I said we're gonna be alright, we're gonna be alright. Just take a look at the sky. We're gonna be alright.
Lift it up to the ceiling, 'cause we all need the healing. Let's get lost in the feeling, the feeling, the feeling. Lift it up to the ceiling, 'cause we all need the healing. Let's get lost in the feeling, the feeling. We're gonna be alright.
We're gonna be alright, we're gonna be alright. I see the look in your eyes. We're gonna be alright. I said we're gonna be alright, we're gonna be alright. Just take a look at the sky. We're gonna be alright. We're gonna be alright, we're gonna be alright. I see the look in your eye. We're gonna be alright. I said we're gonna be alright, we're gonna be alright. I said we're gonna be alright, we're gonna be alright.
God mercy, full of grace, you are forever
What if we told you every hero, real or imagined, follows the same ancient path to greatness? And what if we told you you're on the same journey? To journey without being changed is to be a nomad. To change without journeying is to be a chameleon. To journey and be transformed by the journey is to be a pilgrim. Join us Sundays online on Watershed's Facebook page and YouTube channel, and in person, both indoors and outdoors, at 10 a.m.
As promised, I am back. And before I dive into the announcements, what's going on here at Watershed, I want to wish a warm happy birthday to Pam Watson and a warm belated birthday to Molly Anderson. So if the two of you are watching, happy birthday. If not, someone text them and tell them that Watershed wishes them a happy birthday. So, as you just saw, the promo for our next series tell you. And as I mentioned a moment ago, we are in fact meeting in person starting next week, April 18th. What is that going to look like? To some degree, we don't know. We are optimistic, but who knows? But here's what we think is going to happen. We have a cap or a max of about 50 people, not about, exactly 50 people, inside. Those people are going to be masked. They are going to be distanced. Temperatures are going to be taken. The room is going to be prepared in such a way as to maximize safety and responsibility. We will also have people meeting outside, again, safely distanced and masked. And it is going to be incredibly awesome to see so many of you in person. If you want to join us in person, and I hope you do, what does that look like? Well, if you want to be one of the people inside, you need to pre-register. We need to have a sense of who, not only how many people are going to be inside, but who those people are, so that we can do responsible contact tracing if indeed that proves to be necessary. And so there's going to be a link in the comments for you to pre-register if you want to join us safely inside. And if you want to be outside, you don't need a link. You can just show up. But here's where it gets complicated. You might have kids. You might want to be bringing those kids. And maybe you want to be outside, but you want to check your kids in. Well, even though you do not need to pre-register to be outside, your kids do, or you need to pre-register your kids in order for them to participate in the greenhouse space, birth through 5th grade, because we do have caps on those spaces as well. So to recap so far, if you want to join us safely distanced inside, you need to pre-register. There's going to be a link. If you want to join us safely distanced outside, you do not need to pre-register, but whether you are in or out, if you want to check your kids in, birth through 5th grade, you need to pre-register those kids. Well, maybe you have kids who are older than that. Maybe you have kids who are in middle school or high school. Awesome. They do not need to pre-register. They are welcome to join us if they feel comfortable, or if you feel comfortable with them joining us downstairs in the basement, the usual student space. It's large, very spread out, which is why we're not requiring the pre-registration for our middle and high school students. But even if they are not yet ready to join us indoors, in person, masked and distanced, middle school and high school students are also invited to join us immediately following the service outside around 11 o'clock once the parking lot clears out, because the middle and high school students, Shed students, our student ministry here, is going to be kind of just hanging out, having a welcome back event, outdoors, games, food, and then, of course, all of the same safety measures. And, surprise, surprise, you do need to pre-register for that, or at least I am begging you to, so that I know how much food to order. So, that's a lot. Just to recap, we are meeting together in person next week, indoors, got to pre-register. Link is in the chat. Outdoors, do not have to pre-register. Just show up. We're excited to see you. Kids do have to pre-register. Birth through 5th grade. Again, the link will be in the chat. Students do not have to pre-register, but if they want to hang out with us afterwards outside, they do. Surprise, surprise, the link will be in the chat. I think that covers everything for next week. But what else is going on today? Our students are meeting tonight on Zoom, hopefully our very last time, meeting only digitally. So if you do have a middle school or high school student, you can head to watershed.com/watershed-students, or just go to the student section of our website, and there'll be a link for what is hopefully, again, our final online Zoom gathering as a group. We also have Preface starting very soon, April 14th. I believe that's next Wednesday. If you don't know what Preface is, if you're new to Watershed or have been here a little bit and are still kind of trying to figure out what we are all about, then Preface is the experience for you. It will be a fully digital 3-week dialogue between hopefully you and our founding pastors, Matt O'Neill and Scott Hofert, where you will have a chance to explore your own faith and spiritual journey, hear a little bit about Watershed's journey and history, and explore whether or not those two journeys, those two histories might mesh together. And I highly recommend it. I hang out there when I can, hopefully to meet people who I haven't met before, meet the people who are exploring whether or not Watershed might be their spiritual community. And so if that interests you in any way, please sign up, because we do cap it eventually. We want as many people to come as possible, but if you want to absolutely secure your spot before next Wednesday, then there again will be a link in the chat space for you to sign up for Preface. Now, amidst all of the exciting things that are going on here at Watershed, the only one that can really possibly match the excitement that I have about us meeting together in person again next week is the partnership that we are cultivating with the organization Greater Charlotte Rise. Just a few weeks ago, we came to you with a goal of raising $3,000 for this incredible organization, which they will then in turn use for any number of needs as it relates to our housing insecure neighbors. Everything from securing short-term to long-term housing, helping with transportation, bus passes, things like that, while also meeting immediate material needs as they arise. And I'm excited to say that we are in the home stretch of this fundraising effort. We are around $2,500, so just about $500, give or take, a little bit to go in order to meet this goal. The way we framed it from the beginning is if we could get 30 families in at $100 a piece. Obviously, there are some capable of being more generous than that. Thank you. And some who can't swing that but still want to participate. Obviously, you are welcome. This is something our staff has jumped into and really partnered with, and we couldn't be more pleased with the way that all of you have responded. And so it would be so awesome if we could just get over the finish line so that next week in person we would be able to possibly celebrate having met this goal. And so if you want to give directly to this effort, then you can follow all of our normal giving links, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, and then make sure you select Greater Charlotte Rise or the Charlotte Rise Project on the little tab that lets you kind of direct or designate your giving. And so, of course, speaking of which, none of this, the measures technologically and safety-wise that we are taking to make next week possible, obviously our justice partnerships throughout the city, the things that we're doing to prepare our student and children's spaces for meeting together again, and everything that we've done and been called to do or needed to do in order to sustain some semblance of community during this pandemic, none of that would be possible without the ownership that so many of you take financially and materially with your generosity and your resources. And so thank you for that. Thank you for sticking with us in this last year. Thank you for trusting us. Thank you for leaning in times when it was hard, not just financially, but also relationally, emotionally, just in all the ways. We are so grateful. And so thank you. And for those who are looking or wishing to partner with us to give in that way, there are, surprise again, links in the chat in order for you to give safely and securely. You can also go to the giving section of our website to learn a little bit more about how we steward those funds. All in all, Watershed, just thank you for the ways, once again, in which you have stayed connected during this last year. And I'm going to turn things back over to the band, but I will see you again shortly to finish out our series, A Different World is Possible.
like a battlefield, and my heart is overcome by fear, and hope seems like a ship that's lost at sea. My enemies on every side, and I'm tempted to run and hide. Your gentle whisper reaches out to me. Peace that holds me when I'm broken. Sweet peace that passes understanding. When the whole wide world is crashing down, I fall to my knees and breathe in your peace. Fiery arrows whistling, the terror of the night sets in, but I can feel your angels all around, and I am resting underneath the shelter of your mighty wings. Your promises are where my hope is found. Peace holds me when I'm broken. Sweet peace that passes understanding. When the whole wide world is crashing down, I fall to my knees and breathe in peace. I breathe you in. I remember who you are. You're the God who's never far. So I will not be afraid. God, you always keep me safe in your arms. I remember who you are. You're the God who's never far. So I will not be afraid. God, you always keep me safe. You give me peace that holds me when I'm broken. Sweet peace that passes understanding. When the whole wide world is crashing down, I fall to my knees and breathe in. I breathe you in, I breathe you in. Take a deep breath and be still and know that you are God alone.
Good morning. For those who haven't had a chance to meet me yet, my name is Blair, and I actually work with our kids here at Watershed. I was hired 3 weeks before we shut down with this pandemic to be in our greenhouse space. And while it was a very special 3 weeks, there's a lot I still have to learn. But there's also been a sweet part of being able to get to know people even through a virtual space. So I've been here for a little over a year now. And I want to talk about this morning, where is God showing up in my life? Where is the divine present? But before I do, you all should know that I am a recovering control freak. I'm an Enneagram 6, and my breath prayer my whole life has been John 3:30, for God to be bigger and for me to be smaller. I like plans and schedules and routines. I love systems, especially when they work. But this has been a season of me not being in control. This has been a season where I have felt more affirmed, accepted, and like I actually belong. And so I am deeply grateful for the Watershed community. I am grateful that I feel so deeply loved. I am grateful that it's been almost 5 years since I've been back from the West Coast, and this is the first place that I felt like not just that I can be me, but that I'm celebrated for being me. So what's saving me now is the ability for me to feel human. As a pastor and a Southerner and an adult child of an alcoholic even, I have grown up feeling like I am supposed to be hopeful at all times. But this past year, there is needed to be grief. I've needed to weep. The challenges of illnesses, isolation, tragedy, unemployment. Those are the things that have weighed heavy on my heart. And in navigating those and processing those, I realized that I have moved away from a place of callousness to feeling more deeply. That I have moved from willful amnesia to embracing this space. I realize that we are the storytellers of history at this point. But in order to be storytellers that are true, we have to grieve the death of dreams and expectations, the norms that we've been surrounded by for so long. The almost 3 million lives that we've lost during this virus. Shootings, volcanoes that have cut off water supplies to entire islands. And even the 600 people that we've lost in Myanmar. So what's saving me right now is this sacred space where I feel like I actually get to be human. I don't have to be perfect. I don't have to be hopeful. I don't have to be upbeat and positive all the time. But I can grieve in a world that is dying and also be part of building a new world. A paradise that's actually paradise for everyone. And now we'd like to give you space to think and reflect on where God is showing up for you right now. What's saving you? Where might the divine be showing up in the cracks and details and routines of your life?
mist on the mountain, rising from the ground. There's no denying beauty makes a sound. We can't escape it, there's no way to tell. Mist on the mountain rising all around. Give me your heart, give me your soul, sing it with all your might. Come to the fountain, you can be satisfied. There is a peace, there is a love, you can get lost inside. Come to the fountain, let me testify. There is a peace, there is a love, you can get lost inside. Come to the fountain, let me testify.
This a K-drama beat.
It's me again. I know you're shocked. It could be the caffeine, because I've had quite a bit this morning, but in this moment I am struck by the symmetry of what I am at least experiencing here. Because a little over a year ago, mid-March, we were in the middle of a series, not unlike this current one, and I delivered what turned out to be the final in-person message, since we've met together. In the week that followed, midweek, based on what we were seeing in the news, we made the tough call to, at least for the time being, and at least for what we thought at the time would have only been a few weeks, to abandon meeting together in person and shifting to a fully digital format. And now, hopefully, I am now giving the last message exclusively in a fully digital format, because like I mentioned and like we've been mentioning the last couple weeks, next week, the 18th, we are planning to meet together again in person, at least in a limited capacity. So, I don't know. We'll see. But right now, I'm at least a little jittery at the thought. Again, could be the caffeine. For those who don't know me, and it does occur to me that some of you might not, because like I said, I know I'm up here doing announcements and things like that, ribbing on Matt when I get the opportunity, and have been for the last year, but there are new people here at Watershed, people who have joined us during this pandemic, some of whom who have never actually been to or at least in this building that we call home here at Watershed. And so for those who don't know me, or those who at least need a refresher, my name is David Roberts. I don't actually know what my official title is. I'm an associate pastor here. I help steward our justice partnerships here in the city. I oversee our youth group, our student ministry, Shed Students here at Watershed, and and I maintain a few other odd jobs that require my attention from time to time. But for the most part, beyond the official details of my job description, what most people, I suspect, know me for here at Watershed is my love of all things science fiction and fantasy. Cue Tina in the comments saying something about me as it relates to hobbits. And that's true. I think to some degree it's an over-exaggerated facet of my persona. Exaggerated because you only get a limited piece of me from time to time as I'm up here on stage sharing it with our talented band and the other amazing members of our teaching team. But it's a facet of my identity and my persona, of my being, that I am all too happy to lean into from time to time, because I think the genres of science fiction and fantasy provide excellent illustrations often that beautifully kind of bring to life some of the deeper spiritual themes and motifs that we, or at least I, attempt to communicate. Not that other people don't, but in the way that I attempt to communicate them here from the stage at Watershed. Tommy's laughing at me because of how I worded that. But the reason I bring this up is not just to reintroduce all of you to me, but in a series titled A Different World is Possible, it strikes me that perhaps the world of science fiction and fantasy might have something to offer us when it comes to imagining and envisioning and struggling for the realization and the actualization of that different world. But as I reflected upon that in preparation for our time together this morning, it also occurred to me that what we think of as fantasy in a genre sense, in literature and in film and television, doesn't often match the notion of fantasy as it relates to our psyches. What do I mean by that? Well, genre fantasy, literature, novels, fiction, film and television, what makes them potent and powerful often is that they take a fantasy world, a fantastical world, a futuristic world perhaps, one that includes elves and aliens, and yet it makes it feel very human, very real, very flawed. The best of fantasy is the fantasy that we maybe for a moment forget is in fact fantasy because of how true it seems, even though it is quite obviously fiction. But when it comes to personal fantasies, the imaginations born out by our desires, fantasy takes on a more utopian hue or bent. Because at least on a personal level, on a psychological level, or a psychoanalytic level, fantasy names our dreams, our visions for wholeness, for purity, for goodness, for the absolute. Because on some level there is a kind of finiteness, finitude, a lack within us that we are always scrambling and struggling to fill. And at least on a personal level, fantasy names that utopian urge to fill or at least cover over, to disavow that hole, that lack, that rupture in our being and find some sense of equilibrium. To get back to some fictive, I'm going to argue, some imagined starting place of equal or wholeness. And so in that sense, on a personal level, fantasy runs counter to the way that we typically conceive of it in fiction. Because, think about some of the best, or at least in my opinion, some of the best fantasies. Think about Lord of the Rings. At the end of his journey, Frodo, the ring bearer, bears the scars of his journey, and he actually goes into what is essentially the Middle-earth version of heaven, bearing those scars, not free or cured, but having to carry with him the memory and the legacy and the trauma of the journey it took to get to this kind of place of fulfillment. Or in Star Wars, Luke Skywalker finishes the hero's journey. More on that in a few weeks. But he finishes the hero's journey, and then the next time we find him decades later, he is a cynical recluse, having exiled himself onto a distant planet, hoping to live out his last days, not in peace, but in torment. And so in so many ways, whereas genre fantasy, once again, matches our experience of the world, our personal fantasies are an attempt to flee from it, to cover over it, to disavow it. So how does that factor into our attempts to imagine that a different world is possible? Not just imagine it, but struggle together to achieve it. Well, first I want to make some suggestions about what it must not mean, or what we should perhaps not do in our attempt to both imagine and realize this new world. The first thing that I think we need to abandon, and I'll be unpacking this for the rest of our time together, so buckle up. But the first thing that I think we need to some degree abandon is this notion of utopia. Lean into the fact that these pursuits of wholeness may in fact be in vain, and they actually may cause more harm to ourselves and others than good. And a great illustration, at least on a personal level, that I think of this is the Enneagram. And if you're not familiar with it, don't worry, I'll have other examples. But I know many of you are, and so I think this is a potent one. For me, the Enneagram does not tell us how to achieve wholeness, but it unmasks the fundamental fantasy that we imagine and pursue, thinking that it will, in fact, bring us wholeness. See, I'm an Enneagram 5, and so my fundamental fantasy is that at some point I may, in fact, achieve enough competency, enough knowledge, enough information to make myself secure in the world. And that if I just know enough, if I just make myself useful enough through the information that I can provide, then eventually I will feel safe, I will feel secure, I will feel needed, and I will feel whole, saved. And it looks different for other numbers. Blair talked about some of the fundamental fantasies a moment ago of an Enneagram 6. Control, security born through the predictability of systems that go as planned. If you're an Enneagram 1, your fundamental fantasy might be a notion of truth, moral clarity that allows you to know how to act rightly in the world. For Enneagram 9s, it's a notion of peace or tranquility. And so the value of the Enneagram for me is not in giving us some sort of pathway or formula or system by which we can then achieve these fundamental fantasies, but rather it's unmasking the idol that we project onto ourselves and onto the world that we need to die to in order to make peace with the sort of rupture or not at oneness that is latent with our identity, latent with being human, just inherent to our mere humanity. But y'all, we don't just do this fantasy thing on an individual level. We do it on a societal level. Our very economic system, capitalism, it's like the air we breathe or the water we swim in. And yet, it is premised upon this notion of fantasy and desire, this belief, this lie, this fiction that if we can just consume enough, acquire enough, accumulate enough, that we will in fact be whole. No, of course, this never works. If you have experienced buyer's remorse in your life, you know that. Or if you look at any number of tragic celebrity stories wherein fame and riches ultimately did not satisfy, then you know what I'm saying to be true. But that is what our entire way of life is built on, and it leads to all forms and numbers of exploitation. And when that fiction does begin to crumble at the seams, then we create new utopian fantasies in order to justify our continued allegiance and submission to this system. Racism fall under this category. Because when the system of exploitation is no longer satisfying in the way that it promises, then we need to identify a scapegoat. We need to find a narrative, a reason, a group, an individual to blame as the obstacle, as the reason that this fantasy, this utopian desire of ours is not ultimately securing and saving us. And so what do? We create these objectified, pathologized notions of identity. We blame it on them, the other, their laziness. And don't miss the inherent contradictions of these stereotypes and these generalizations, because at the same time that we're maybe pointing to one racialized group of people and saying that the reason that I am not able to achieve the wholeness that this way of life has promised me is or the reason that they are not is because of some pathology in them, we then also take that same group of people, and this would work for the way that blackness or that brownness has been pathologized in our country. We also then look at that same group of people and say, well, they're getting in the way. They're taking my job, or they're taking the thing that is rightfully mine, that I have earned, and that is going to bring me wholeness. And so obviously there's a contradiction in that narrative, but our fantasy doesn't care about that. It just wants us to not pay attention to what's actually going on. It wants us to continue to obsessively, pathologically pursue this notion of wholeness, of security, of salvation, scapegoating whatever or whoever we need to in order to achieve it. And so both on an individual and a societal level, there is this sense in which this notion of fantasy, this notion of utopia, this notion of wholeness, completeness, of good, that we are so desperate to pursue because we are so convinced that it is the thing that is going to make us feel safe and secure in the world, is precisely the thing that buffers us and pits us against one another. And so if we're going to try to imagine and struggle for a world that doesn't fall into this trap, that doesn't fall into this loop of both imagining that there is some wholeness that we are owed or that we need, and then pathologizing those who we imagine are getting in the way of it, then what does it look like? Because, like I said before, on some level, with the Enneagram example, this is almost hardwired into our very being, and with the examples of kind of the systems that structure our world, it seems to also be hardwired into our society. So what does this look like? How do we escape this? How do we get around it? Or maybe more accurately, how do we go through it and come out the other side? Well, this is a sermon at a church, if you can call us that. Wink, wink, Tommy. But so in that sense, perhaps we should turn to the Bible, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. Not literally. I'm not going to actually open one, but I'm going to describe, hopefully in vivid detail, two very well-known passages within the Bible. The first takes us all the way back to the beginning. Not quite to the beginning, 3 chapters into the beginning, Genesis 3. And I'm going to sort of take for granted that you're familiar with this passage, but just in case you're not, a brief summary. Adam and Eve, who for our purposes are standing in, are representative of the whole of humanity. Please do not get hung up on the historicity of this story. That's not what this message is about. Whether or not this really happened as described, I think there is something fundamentally and profoundly true about this story. So here's Adam and Eve. They're in the garden. Almost the prototypical notion of wholeness or fulfillment. But I want you to notice something right off the bat. When this serpent shows up and begins to tempt Adam and Eve, the logic of temptation suggests that at least on some level, they had some sense of their own finitude, their finiteness, their lack of wholeness, because what is temptation if not our longing and being drawn towards that which we think is ultimately going to bring wholeness? So the very fact that this serpent was able to come in and then tempt Adam and Eve with some sort of promised notion of wholeness or safety or salvation suggests to me that at least on some level, whether they are real or mythical or imagined, we shared the same humanity, the same finitude, the same not at oneness with ourselves, with our archetypical ancestors, Adam and Eve. And so here they are, in all of their lack in humanity, being tempted by this talking snake. And what does the serpent tempt them with? If you eat of this tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and that is key, knowledge of good and evil, you will be like God. You will be whole. You will finally achieve this sense of security and salvation that you so desperately long for. To be like God, per the serpent, per the lie of the serpent, I'm suggesting, is to know good and evil, to know what is in and what is out, what is pure, what is impure, what is right, what is wrong, and to know it with such certainty that you can see it done. And so in this sense, what is, for our purposes, what is original sin, if not the very development and formation of these fundamental fantasies that we pursue so desperately that we are willing to scapegoat as evil any and all that gets in our way, any and all that we perceive or even project onto them that might rob us or impede us from achieving the divine state in which we are owed. We've built our entire civilization on this fundamental lie, that if only we gather the right people into this space and exclude or scapegoat the wrong people or the wrong ideas or the wrong way of being in the world out here, out of the garden, out of the inner circle, then finally, truly, we will have arrived at our inherent and owed divinity. Now, don't hear what I'm not saying in this. I am not saying that just because there's this sense in which we pursue one thing over the other, therefore all of the ways of being in the world, all of the ways that we structure ourselves are equally good or equally bad. I'm not trying to make a relativistic argument here. There are certainly ways of being in the world that are more harmful, more abusive, more inherently traumatic. I'm not so much denying evil as much as I am trying to problematize our notion of the good, of the perfect, of the whole, or pure. Because I actually think that our issue is not so much in our ability to recognize evil. That's quite healthy, actually. But in our projection of what is in fact good and pure and holy, and our pursuit of that, such that anything we name or identify as evil must be eliminated, be it real or symbolically. And so if this is the fundamental break, the fundamental miss, the fundamental lie that we have pursued with vigor throughout human history, then what solution do we have in response? What solution does the Bible offer? Well, at the risk of being cliche, the Bible's answer to this is Jesus, or at least the New Testament's answer to this is Jesus. And at the risk of being even more cliche, what do we mean by Jesus if not the biblical answer of love? And at the risk of being yet again even more cliche, is not the best illustration of what is meant by love and by Jesus perhaps the most famous verse in the entire Bible, John 3:16. For God so loved the world that God gave God's one and only Son, that whosoever believe in the Son won't perish, but have the life everlasting, the life eternal. Translation mine, basically. So what does this mean? What is this notion of love as personified in Christ? What is this notion of divinity as revealed or declared in the person of Jesus? Well, I want to start with a word. It's a complicated word. You weren't going to escape David and his complicated words this morning. I apologize. But that word is sublimation, the sublime. What does this mean? It actually means a lot of things. It has a different meaning in chemistry and physics than it does in the way that I'm using it this morning. But in philosophy, to sublimate, to identify something as the sublime, is to take it in all of its flaws, all of its finitude, all of its impurity, and elevate it to the level of the absolute. It's to see in the finite, see in the broken, see in the ruptured, the very wholeness of divinity. And so I want to suggest to you this morning that the biblical notion of love as revealed in Christ, the biblical notion of divinity as revealed in the person of Jesus, matches this notion of sublimation. To love is to look at this and say, this is that. Because what desire does, what fantasy does, is to say, this is not that. This thing that I have achieved, this thing that I am pursuing, when I finally get it, it is not that which will make me whole. And so the cycle begins anew, and in our frustration, we look for people or systems or things to blame. And just to be clear, that doesn't mean that there often aren't people or systems to blame for abuse and for trauma. I'm not saying that. But what sublimation does, what love does, is it allows us to take this broken, this flawed, this finite thing, and say that it is precisely in this traumatized thing. And that thing, by the way, might be you. I am going to see and find and identify the infinite, the absolute, the divine. So what does this look like? Well, The Apostle Paul is quite insistent throughout most of the rest of the New Testament that God has revealed God's self, God has described God's self in the person of Jesus, and most crucially in the person of Jesus as revealed in the crucifixion on the cross. And not to identify God with the violence that killed Jesus, but perhaps to say that God is revealing God's self precisely in the trauma of existence most purely and truly exemplified in the person of the crucified Christ. Paul describes this as, he says it in a lot of different ways. He talks about that he desires to know nothing but Christ and him crucified. He says to live is Christ and to die is gain. He says, for we are crucified in Christ and we no longer live, but it is Christ who lives in us. Paul sees as very crucial to this notion of Christ and by extension to this notion of God, and then therefore by extension to this notion of love. Paul sees Christ on the cross. And so on some level, this scandalously scrambles the way that we imagine divinity, the way that we imagine reconciliation, the way that we imagine our own security, because paradoxically speaking, to be loved, to experience, to encounter the divine is to come face to face with the very trauma of our humanity, with the very trauma of our existence, of the flawed and finite ways that we present and arrive and exist within the world, and that to encounter the divine is to trust and believe and put faith in that this very vulnerability, this very trauma, this very brokenness is, in the estimation of God, elevated to the level of the absolute, to the infinite, to the divine. And that's my contention for you this morning. So what does that look like practically? Well, first, we have to answer the question, I think, what does this mean we have to abandon? And so the first thing I want us to abandon is this notion of the good. And now there's some semantics here. Tommy and I were actually talking about it this morning. What I mean by good is this notion of perfection, this notion of purity, this notion of utopia, this notion of wholeness that we so desperately pursue at the expense of ourselves and more often others. Because if we allow ourselves to be made vulnerable in the vulnerability that quite frankly is already inherent to our very finiteness, to our very humanity, if we allow ourselves to lean into that of vulnerability, then my contention to you this morning is that is where we are actually, kind of paradoxically speaking, most secure in God. And what does that look like? Being made vulnerable in ourselves frees us. It frees us of the way that we buffer ourselves over and against each other. It frees us for genuine solidarity. It frees us to be with and for each other, transgressing the contradictions that divide us, transgressing, going through, not around, not covering over, but transgressing the ways in which we so often put up these walls to make ourselves feel safe and secure over and against the other or the stranger. And so in abandoning this notion of the good, we are not abandoning hope. We are not abandoning love. Quite the opposite. We are leaning into them, freeing us then for vulnerable solidarity with and for each other. And the New Testament tells us that is precisely where God is most clearly manifest. And so if that's what we're doing on a personal level, on a present level, what does this look like more broadly on a societal level? And here's where I perhaps will be making many of you uncomfortable. I think this means we have to abandon heaven. Now, we did sing about that last week. We sang the John Lennon song, Imagine. Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. But is it? I don't think it's that easy. Because whether it's our attempts to bring heaven to earth in the here and now, or our projections of heaven off in the future, maybe after we die or after Jesus comes back, we still lean into this notion of heaven as a sort of crutch that justifies either our pursuits in the here and now, which may include scapegoating again, which may include the literal or symbolic elimination of that which impedes our pursuit of heaven, or it may give us implicit permission to not do anything now, to struggle for a better world, precisely because God's just going to fix it in the end anyway. And so it's ironic, I'm not opposed to this, but it's ironic that so much of, whatever this is, kind of progressive Christianity, is caught up in the abolition of hell, an enterprise that I am very invested in. And yet, I also think we need to divert some of our attention to heaven. Now, don't hear what I'm not saying. I am not making any sort of definitive proclamations this morning about what the afterlife is going to look like. Quite frankly, I remain an optimist. But this notion of heaven, this notion of utopia that we can somehow enact in the here and now, or just kind of leave off as God's problem in the future, it's premised on this notion of good that I think is doing us harm. So if we are, at least in the way that I've defined it this morning, if we are abandoning the good and if we are burning heaven to the ground, dramatic, I know, but if that's what we're doing, then what does the Bible, what does Jesus, what does God, and I'm going to suggest not exclusively those things, but at least for my purposes this morning, what are we left with in response? 3 things. And this is what I'm going to leave you with. Faith, hope, and love. Well, what does that look like? Faith. And I think faith goes hand in hand with this biblical notion of grace. Faith is the radical insecurity that I've talked about. In every instance in the biblical narrative where it said that the character in question acted out in faith, it was a rupture, an interruption, a sort of an apocalyptic break with whatever made that person feel safe and secure and whole in the world. And they stepped out in faith, in this vulnerability. And it was precisely in that vulnerability that they were to transgress the lines of difference that so often divide us and enter into this new world, this new way of being in the world that reflected God. And so the first thing we need to lean into is this notion of faith, this radical vulnerability wherein, paradoxically speaking, sort of against common sense, we are made radically insecure in ourselves, which then frees us to be radically secure in each other, and therefore, by extension, radically secure in God. We need to have faith. And where grace comes into that is grace is kind of a, well, it's kind of like love. It's kind of an elevation of that vulnerability, paradoxically kind of in this backwards, twisted sense, into the very security that we seek. To be secure, we need to be vulnerable. As Matt and Scott said last week, to experience resurrection, we cannot go around death. We have to go through the trauma of it. So the first thing we need is faith. The second is hope. And hope I'm very closely tying this morning to joy. Hope is not this naive disavowal of the reality of the brokenness of our lot in life, but hope is this courageous or defiant nevertheless. Just as joy does not seek to paper over trauma or tragedy with some sort of artificial happiness, some sort of store-bought glee that allows us to pretend as if the experiences that we had did not happen or are not as real as we experienced them. If happiness gaslights us, then joy and hope give us space to lament, and yet also call us to a certain kind of courage to say, even so, I will persist. 2 of my favorite movies of all time, I think, capture this beautifully. One, The Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, wherein, to spoil it because it's been out for 2 decades and you had your chance, wherein the 2 protagonists, the main couple in the story, played by Jim Carrey and Kate Winslet, they are together for some time, and because of their tics and flaws and traumas, they inevitably break up. And the breakup is so traumatic for them that they pursue this fictive technology wherein they are able to erase themselves from each other's memories. And then, as serendipity or fate would have it, they, completely oblivious of this past experience with each other, find each other again and begin to fall in love. Well, for the purpose of the movie, they then become aware after this, after they begin to fall in love again, they realize that they did in fact have a prior relationship, and it ended tragically. It ended basically as a train wreck, and for all intents and purposes, that failure is once again inevitable. And yet, in the face of that failure, in the face of the near certainty that this isn't going to work, they say, you know what, we'll take it. We'll take it. We will take it in all of its flaws and imperfections. We will take it in all of its likely failures. We'll take it. They say, yeah, even so. even so, because on some level there is a sense, there is a hope, there is a belief and a joy in the fact that it is in failure that new possibility is born. And that failure is not so much an obstacle to possibility, but the very ingredients of it. That's what I mean by hope. So if faith is the thing that makes us vulnerable in ourselves, thus freeing us to be with and for one another, and hope is the thing that allows us to find the nevertheless of possibility at the very site and foundation of our failures and flaws, then the final ingredient of this different world, of course, then is love. And this takes us back to that notion of sublimation that I was talking about before. I don't know exactly what this is going to look like. I'm not here to give us some sort of formula for what this struggle is going to mean, but I think this idea of love, I think this biblical notion, this Christ-like notion of finding the infinite, finding the absolute, finding the divine, not at the expense, not at the filling, not at the papering over of all of our flaws and imperfections, but precisely in and through them, offers us something, Again, it's not going to be a formula. Formulas are precisely the thing that I'm saying we need to avoid, because formulas are the thing that we are going to be convinced are going to make us whole. Love is messier than that. Love is more meandering than that. Love is more unstable than that. Love doesn't give us that kind of guarantee. Love is more of a summons, an invitation, a mandate, to see in the very authenticity that we bring to one another in our vulnerability, to see in those flaws, to see in those imperfections, to see in those ways in which the pieces don't quite fit like a puzzle, but if we step back and look at it in the right light, it maybe comes together like a beautiful mosaic. Love is the thing that sets us free. Be free in our humanity, free in our finitude, free in all of our flaws and imperfections, not free to not struggle forward, not free to just accept the mediocrity of status quo and the trauma and the oppression that it scapegoats and puts upon the most vulnerable and the most marginalized, not free to live in that world, but free precisely in the opposite way, free to struggle against that, to resist it in solidarity with one another, free to imagine not a utopia, but something else entirely, something that is so alien, so foreign to our present way of being and imagining the world, that the only way that we can describe it is as a kind of new creation. But not a new creation that disavows and papers over or paints over and pretends that this old world that is passing away didn't happen, but one that leaves us free to both celebrate and lament the very finitude and flawed nature of that which is passing away, precisely because it gives us the ingredients of possibility to make something new. So that's where I'll leave you, with the words of the seminal sage and philosopher Buzz Lightyear. To achieve this different world, to struggle together for it, to imagine that this different world is in fact possible today, we have to go, again, I'm going to amend Buzz here a little bit, not to infinity and beyond, but through infinity and beyond. Because beyond this biblical notion of the infinite and through it is a genuine encounter and an experience with our trauma, with the ways that we have hurt and exploited one another. It's not a reconciliation of, but a reconciliation with the ways that we have created hell for each other. And it's precisely in that being with that we are then made free to make reparation, both personally and systemically, for the ways that we've hurt each other. And so what I want to leave you with today is through infinity and beyond, through love, through all of our impurity, all of our profanity, all of our brokenness, with, for, and through one another. Watershed, I'm really excited to see you all next week in person. Grace and peace.
You say